Hello and good evening. I'm Robert Leckie, Director at Spike Island. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation between our guests, Veronica Ryan and Darby English, who will be discussing Ryan's practice and her exhibition Along a Spectrum, which is currently on view in our galleries. The works in the show were made during an extended residency at Spike Island over the past 2 years, and they explore the fragility of the natural environment and the psychological impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout the exhibition, everyday objects such as bandages, food containers, and medical pillows have been manipulated and repurposed to create works that speak of resilience and attempts at recovery. It's Ryan's most ambitious show to date and is generously supported by the Freelance Foundation through the 2018 Freelance Award. We'll start shortly with an introduction to both Veronica and Darby, who will be in conversation for about 45 minutes. At that point, I'll return and we'll take questions from the audience. We encourage you to use the chat function in YouTube Live throughout, but please note that both the chat and the live stream are being recorded and will be archived on our website after the event. We're moderating the chat and ask you to please refer to our code of conduct, which is being linked in the chat box now before you contribute. But without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers. So Veronica Ryan was born in 1956 in Plymouth, Montserrat, and she currently works between New York and the UK. She studied at St Albans College of Art and Design, Bath Academy of Art at Corsham Court, and the Slade School of Art and SOAS in London. Her first solo exhibition was held at the Arnolfini here in Bristol in 1987, and more recent exhibitions include Salvage at the Art House in Wakefield in 2017, The Weather Inside at the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh in 2011, Archaeology of the Black Sun at Selina Gallery in Long Island in 2005, and Coit Montserrat at Tate St Ives in 2000. Her work's also been included in numerous group exhibitions, including Castlefield Gallery in Manchester, Tanner Art Gallery in Eastbourne, Nottingham Contemporary, the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, and the Brooklyn Museum in New York. She currently has new commissioned works on display at the Hepworth Gallery in Wakefield as part of Barbara Hepworth Art and Life, which is the largest exhibition of Barbara Hepworth's work since her death in 1975. Ryan's also been the recipient of many awards and prizes, most recently including the 2019 Pollock-Pressner Grants, the 2018 Freelance Award, and the Hackney Art Windrush Commission, which is due to be unveiled this autumn. Darby English is an art historian whose works unlock new dimensions of American art through rigorous attention to form. His books include How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness from 2007, 1971, A Year in the Life of Colour from 2016, and To Describe a Life, Notes from the Intersection of Art and Race Terror from 2019, for which he was awarded a CAA Frank Jewett Mather Award for Art Criticism. English has also co-edited the volumes Carl Walker, Narratives of a Negress from 2002, and Art History and Emergency from 2016. He's the Carl Darling Buck Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago, and from 2014 to 2020, he was also Adjunct Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So having said all of that, I'd now like to hand over to Veronica and Darby to begin their conversation. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert, and thanks everyone at Spike for all of the work they did to make this possible, tracking me down during an impossible semester, keeping me honest. And thanks, Veronica. It's really great to see you again.
Yeah, really nice. Thank you.
We met. I'm going to tell you something that you know already for the benefit of people watching and listening. We met for the first time in the fall of 2019, right before the shit show started. The ongoing global health crisis shit show and a social and political crisis as well as it happens. And then we stopped talking, but you know, we touched on things in the course of that conversation at Paul Cooper that had been very important for both of us long before that conversation and have remained important to both of us in the meantime. And in the past couple of days, in talking about talking today, I've noticed, you know, how easy and how easy it has been to pick up almost right where we left off. which is an incredibly comforting feeling to have. But what's striking to me about the setting that we're in, the context, is that we're talking about and looking at art that you created and have organized very much in response to the manifold events and traumas and difficulties and reflections of the period since we began our conversation, and of the pandemic. And it seems to me an exhibition that is thinking and forming out of a reflection on just how many dimensions of experience have been touched and affected by all of this. So I would just like to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about how what we're looking at on the screen shows us the thinking that you've been doing and the forming that you've been doing in the process.
Well, it's interesting to see how some past works reconnect with current situations globally. So that thinking about pandemics, we're in a multiple, it struck me that we're experiencing multiple pandemics, and that it's a global epidemic that we've been experiencing on different levels. And so it's manyfold in the sense that when I started the residency at Spike, the exhibition was going to happen about a year ago, and then the first pandemic, the first lockdown happened, and I went back to New York. But then, because I tend to work across and travel with materials in my bag, I was able to continue work in New York and traveling. But there was one period where everywhere was shut down, the shops, everywhere, and there weren't any people on the streets. And actually that was quite frightening. It sort of, the first few days you thought, oh my goodness, this is really going to happen for a period of time. And then somehow it became quite a comfortable state to be in. Because in a way, that's how I tend to work. I tend to work in a private way. And that's coincided with a period of years where my work wasn't visible and I didn't have many resources, and I just worked with things around me. And sometimes it got a bit hair-raising because, I was also taking care of 2 small children. Mm-hmm. And I gave up a studio I had in New York because I couldn't pay for a studio and, have finances to do all the other things you have to do. So things started to merge, really, the sense of domestic crises and then this global crises, and then thinking about how different people, different communities, different cultural groups have been affected more radically than some groups, even though we've all been suffering. And so I got into a mode where I felt a kind of safe space amongst this pending kind of crisis around us. And so that was a period where I crocheted a number of the hanging sculptures in one of the galleries. And because on the one hand, I knew that I had intended to put structures in the sack at the bottom, and then wanted to make some of them quite long. And so if there wasn't the extended if there wasn't the lockdown and Spike not operating, nowhere operating at all, I wouldn't have made these long lengths of crocheted structures. So in a funny kind of way, it became quite a useful period for me. And at the end of it, I didn't really want to go out. And in lots of ways, I would prefer not to have to go out. There's something secure, but it's also not very healthy, because when I did go out, my limbs didn't work properly. You know, you suddenly realize that actually that our bodies are meant to move around, and if one stays static, you know, your body takes on this sort of very introverted, sort of kind of sleep-like state. So these are all, that in a way ties up with earlier work and current work and different levels of dialogue, if that makes any sense.
It does. It actually does a lot. It makes a deep sense of something from the work, around the work, in the work. I don't know where it is located precisely, and that doesn't much matter. But what you just said, physical memory that I have of the way that things that you make are bound into wholes, either from multiple components which have been, like, you know, some kind of binding has brought them together, and they're tied together, or they're sewn together, or they're held in some way or another. And that sense of holding is one that's very profound for me. It doesn't impart the closure of a seal or a tomb, or even this coffee cup, which has a nice tight-fitting lid. The closure that the forms I remember meeting in the fall of 2019 with you is a much more, I keep wanting to say agitated closure, but agitated is not the right word, because it sounds troubled and or like it wants to make trouble and it's not being allowed to, or something. There's just something a little bit fraught about the kind of closure, so that one is aware. I am aware of the binding action. I'm as aware of the binding action as I am aware of the bound form itself. And I think about holding. I say holding. I hear myself say holding, and I think about Winnicott, who is someone I know that you know and think about, and like you talk about the comfort that you took in being able to continue making objects your way, like in a private way, in the midst of a crisis. So it's hard not in that connection to think about a way in which the crisis itself was holding you, and which is a difficult thing to say, because of how much we know about the breakages it has caused.
Yes, yeah.
The untold pain and loss, much of it irreparable, that has been caused. But at the same time, as in simultaneous to those actions of and those events of total loss, total discomposure, total discombobulation, it's simultaneous to those have been moments of peace. It's, and as you say, that's something which is, it feels more urgent to identify in the work as we look at it and talk about it in this historical moment. But it is something that I remember as having been present before. And if I'm not mistaken, the show at Paula's, you called it after the same title that you gave The Mattress Factory. So it was already carrying over from 8 years previous,
Yes,
an idea about the weather inside. And we talked so much about the light that day. That was such an incredible fucking room. That fucking room. What a fucking room. I mean, anyway, so I don't know, am I being clear about it? Is this doing anything for you?
No, absolutely. No, absolutely.
I'm crying for some reason.
Yeah, it's, well, you know what, it's someone came to my show at Spike, and people have been talking a lot about the color, And the colour's really important, but I'm not going away from what you said. It's part of what you've said, but also the way that colour is very inviting. And I was going around again yesterday and thinking about viruses, in fact, how beautiful viruses are when you're looking at microscopic images of disease and all the different kind of very contagious viruses. The colours are tremendous and they're really beautiful structures, but inherent within that structure, those structures is this toxicity, there's death and there's grief. And so I'm really interested in these polarities, how we can have these kind of opposing things happening at the same time. And so our emotions are kind of pivoting around. And so when you talked about holding, so the crocheted structures hold, but they've got gaps in them. And so it's a kind of precarious holding. And so in a way, thinking about spider webs as well, and how that kind of very strong net structure could still be ruptured. You could still poke it very hard and it will disintegrate in some way. And so part of the holding and part of something looking stable, there's inherent its opposite. And so I'm quite interested in the kinds of contradictory world we're in. And, you know, this chaos, and we're having to deal with a lot of inherent grief, which reminds us quite a lot of inherited grief, what one, how much and what exactly one's inherited, and the environment one's in that feels very caustic sometimes, and sometimes one isn't quite clear what that wound is, what the grief is, but it's there pretty much. And then one has to find a way to go outside. One has to find a way to be with people and in the world. And so, you know, there are quite a lot of these different aspects of along a spectrum that I'm quite interested in.
Yeah.
You know, whatever the spectrum could be, different kinds of spectrums. But so it's talking about these different realities.
Yeah. When you said just now, I think in three different kind of iterations, one has to find a way, one has to find a way, one has to find a way. And I think that I couldn't agree more, you know, but I also know that we're surrounded by people who don't feel that imperative, who do not feel as though they have to find a way. And that's something that one has to respect, or at least learn to accept and live with as a reality that the other may present to us, that we have to deal with. We have to find a way to deal with they who do not have to find a way, or do not feel as though they have to find a way. I'm saying this not for the sake of conjecture, but because of something that I see in a lot of the images that I received from Spike for the conversation today, images of the presentation in the galleries, in which I see a lot of situations you've created, beginning with the crocheted sack into which one can see. You know, a lot of situations where looking at your work means looking through something, be it through a sack or through a room full of things, toward a wall on which something might also be hanging, through a shelf, past and around the objects on the shelf, down to objects on the floor beneath the shelf, through the structure or the armature of the shelf itself, to either empty space or more art-filled space. There's a lot of, I feel as though your imperative, one has to find a way, am I putting it in the room, or is it there because you want it to be? Do you think there's is there any truth to what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I work compulsively, so even
Me too. I know what that's like.
yeah. I mean, we make fun of it when I've been in the you know, at Paula Cooper and at Spike. Right at the last minute, there's still something that I think I've got to work on, or if people didn't left me alone in there the next day, the exhibition would be quite different. So there's a kind of obsessiveness about trying to sort out kind of psychological truths, psychological ways of being in the world. And so I really, the color is important because it gives people a way into the work. And I like that I found a way to incorporate a lot of different paradigms in terms of stitching and casting and molding. I think for a long time, I kept all the activities separate. So I would sometimes knit sweaters or items of clothing. But when I started to feel a freedom that actually all these different modalities could come together to make structures, it gave me a different kind of freedom in the work. It seemed to open up a whole different way of, it gave me a kind of liberty to not care whether, you know, it was craft. I tend not to like the work been described as a craft element or a textile element, because I see all the different modes of working as just another way of making the thing that needs to be made.
Yeah, that I'm really glad to hear you say that, because I would have forgotten to invoke craft and, you know, the craft problem if you hadn't mentioned it. But I'm glad that when you did invoke it, you invoked it as a somewhat distracting or possibly reductive matter in the work, as opposed to a congenial paradigm in which to situate the work or see the work through. I see and experience craft, etc. I don't even want to waste time on the list of synonyms and related terms, but I see it as something else to see through in the work. You know, it's there, but there's more behind it. There's more. It's almost art historically, I think, become a cover story for other kinds of things that we would like to be interested in, the ways of thinking about looking. I mean, I feel that your work addresses the hand more immediately than it addresses the eye. You've spoken a lot about color today. My memory of what happened in the space where we met is not a color memory. It's a haptic, tactile memory. In fact, except for some things that I feel like I could count on one hand, it was a fairly monochromatic situation. It was also being blasted by all that beautiful light. So maybe that's a thing that my brain is doing. But anyway, I wanted to ask you if you're able to tell us a little bit about what force impelled the freedom that you just described. You said for a long time I kept all the activities separate. What had to happen in your life or in your studio, in your mind, in order for that separateness to stop being a determining thing and become and become something else, or give way to something else? That seems like a pretty big event.
Yeah, I tend not to like talking too much about some of the big things that have happened, you know, so
talk about
I
a small
will
one.
mention it because, you know, there have been a number of my siblings have committed suicide, and I think for a while it was difficult to work. And so if I was sewing or doing crochet or knitting, it seemed to occupy a particular way of getting through days and getting through moments. And then, I mean, okay, I don't really like being open too much, but I've been in analysis therapy for a long time, and part of working through, you know, materials and grief and so on, was being encouraged that actually you don't need to have all these activities happening separately. You could bring them all into the work, that it's all work. And the fact that I was separating them off meant that I was spending enormous amounts of time actually not making the sculpture or objects or drawings in a way that seemed more holistic, if that makes sense, talking about grief. Bringing all the activities together meant that somehow the momentousness, the everydayness of having to get through moments became a different moment that you could get through. So there you are, you got me to talk about it on in the Nathan Forum.
I wasn't trying.
I know you weren't trying, but somehow, sometimes I feel that there's a kind of secretiveness to the work, but also understanding that just because one tells something doesn't mean that you've told everything. It means that somehow in the telling, one gives space for more telling to happen.
Yeah. I think, well, I would just I would thank you for going there. I know what I have a lot of that myself, and it's in my work in ways that you would have to be me or my therapist or my partner to know like how to identify it. So I appreciate it. There's something I think you talked about psychological truth, you know, earlier, and I knew that you meant your psychological truth and not some kind of universalizable what is true psychologically about people qua people. I knew that. I think it seems important to indicate that what you mean by truth is very local and subjective and contingent upon the discoveries that you're able to make as you work with this material in the presence of others, you know, like sometimes in words in a closed session, but sometimes in materials in an open gallery, or sometimes with a combination of words and materials in a Zoom, whatever the fuck a Zoom is. But I think but that sense of secret is very strong in the work. I don't know what's on the screen right now. It would be useful maybe if we could go to the slide with the pillows. It's number 5 on the PDF that I have. I assume it's okay, thanks. So abstractness is a way to keep a secret. Perhaps. Do you have thoughts about that? I mean, so I'm looking at these forms, which I haven't seen in person yet. And they're full of something. They're handmade. They've been dyed with something natural. There's all kinds of information coming to me about them, but I do not know what is the proper order of that information if I wanted to use that information to construct an account of Veronica Ryan and where her life and mind were when she made these objects. I do not know that information. I do not wish to know that information, because more important for me is to deal with what I'm seeing, which is something full of something, actually contains something, there's batting or some kind of substance inside that's been closed in, it's been hand stitched, and the closed in, hand stitched, dyed, made thing has been set on a shelf in one configuration, on another shelf in another configuration, and on the floor in yet a third configuration. there's much more abstractness to the thing that I'm dealing with than there is information. I get excited in the presence of, I don't know why, but I get excited in the presence of a problem like that, where I see information, but I don't know what to do with it. So it puts me back, it throws me back on myself. I have to use my own resources, whatever they might be today, right now, given nervousness and a time difference and a hatred of Zoom and wishing that I could be with these things in person and be with you in person. Those are all things that contribute into the perception that I'm having right now. And that's actually a lot closer to art for me, even in spite of the lack of presence. That's a lot closer to what I take an art experience to be than like, tell us what you were thinking when you made these. Which is just like, it's not my fucking business. It's not like you shared this. If you wanted me to have a story about where you were and where you've been and how your life got you there, you would have put a story in front of me, not something that makes me think about like hamburgers and bread and so I don't know. I'm just having a response now. I should have a question, but I'm just having a response.
Well, inherent in your response is a question. The pillows, actually, I've made a whole series of pillows in the last few years. Some are actual medical pillows. These are medical pillows, the ones that you're referring to, that I've adapted partly to make them taut structures so that they could be cast, but also to make them more personalized in a particular way. So I like the fact that they look soft, but they're actually hard. And I like the fact that, well, they also have the original pillow there. So they also have their own cushion. And in a funny kind of way, I don't see the work as an abstraction. So I find that quite an interesting paradigm, that the work to me isn't abstract in the sense that I feel as though what you're looking at is what I'm saying, and that it's not an abstraction. So I find the whole language around making and what we experience and what we mean and the kind of nuance of meaning very crucial to how I think. Because in fact, even though there's a lot of writing around the work, in fact, when I'm actually working, I'm not thinking that I'm describing the words that you could read around the work. The writing is about my kind of preoccupations. And then I often start with an idea and start to work out materially how that idea is going to find itself in the making, in the hands.
Yeah.
And so, so thinking about the conversations that I have with myself, and myself giving me directions, and then my hands giving me directions. And so I tend to work on multiple things at the same time, because sometimes the conversation stops and then I have to go and find it in where I stopped at that point in other possibilities, and then come back to things, which is partly why, in a way, there are so many objects on the long shelf, because it's a process of thinking, it's a process of realizing what that thing is. I was having a conversation with someone the other day about if I make portraits, and I explained, actually my work are like self-portraits. I learned to draw. I was explaining that I've made drawings of my siblings, and I found them the other day and I'll give them to them, but it's not the way I'm able to think in an extensive way about what's going on in there and in there and in
Yeah.
the hands. They're different. It's a different kind of conversation I have with myself, which is not like an abstraction to me. It feels like the actual thing, the actual experience that is happening in that moment. And I think that, I mean, thinking about trends and how, you know, for a long time one was mostly seen very conceptual work, and that my work doesn't lack conceptual thinking, but it's very much in the making of how ideas, residual ideas, become formed. And I think that's one of the reasons that I feel that the work is, one of the reasons the work is more visible again. Anyhow, that's just one of the thoughts I've been having about what it means, how you get there, how one makes things, but also how people also relate to those things as well. So I'm pleased when people, an audience, understand something intrinsically for themselves in the work.
Yeah. Would you say that the person asking you about portraiture was maybe wishing for a portrait?
Well, I think it's pretty much, it's a big conversation at the moment, isn't it, about representation.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what that means for me is that there are myriad ways that one could make representation.
Right.
So you know, that's part of my thinking about it.
That's a position that puts you at odds with you know, another way of thinking about representation, which is a much more consensus oriented way of thinking about it, in which the manyness of a population of people, let's say the actual multitude of a multitude, is expected to arrive at a place where everyone can agree, like, okay, yeah, that's a good representation of what we are.
Yeah.
You know, there's the idea that the fact, rather, not the idea, the fact that there are many roads to representation and many ways of working in representation is not yet as widely acknowledged, or I would say allowed, as I think something like basic fairness would recommend or require. So there's just there's so many there are so many dimensions of the question of representation, which for all of the interest in it, for all of the need of representation, there are so many dimensions of the issue that have yet to be explored or formally endorsed by the parties who seem like most I don't know, like most visible or most in control of when that trend of the direction of that trend. I don't know. I mean,
it's very complicated.
It is. I'm trying to put a shorthand to something that I think about literally all the time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and it's not an easy thing to put into a container when one is against containers.
I was thinking about you mentioning the word containers and compartments. And,
oh yeah, I should show everyone my keywords. I didn't even need them.
Yeah, but it's really nice. I really love little emojis on the sides.
Yeah, those are, I can't take credit for those.
Yeah, but they look as though they're thinking quite a lot on different levels.
They are. Yeah, they're having thoughts.
Yeah.
They're helping.
Yeah.
They're helping. Whoever they are.
No, I think that's really nice, because it gives it in a way kind of talks about part of that extended stuff that is quite complicated to negotiate, about who who determines what's visible and not visible, and the different criteria for visibility, and how one copes with periods of not being visible,
yeah,
and what you do about it. And do you continue to work in ways that really exemplifies your own need to be a practitioner? Or does one somehow become part of an expectation? And
right.
then what exactly is that expectation? And anyhow, thinking about this and thinking about the compartments and the space underneath the, one of the reasons I've used glass on the tables and on the shelves is that you could see underneath.
Mhm.
You know, you could move around, but you could also see underneath of things, underneath of the work. And the long shelf, the work I made in New York, some of the structures went through the shelf.
Right.
So I was equally interested in what the object was doing under the shelf. And so I was looking under the shelf again yesterday and decided actually what I want to do next is, rather than just putting things on the shelf, is flip the shelf over, and then it has
Yeah.
all these compartments. And then actually one of the curators here was reminding me, oh, that looks like some of your earlier work where, yeah, exactly right. That's exactly the flipped over underbelly of the shelf, exactly.
This is a work called Lean from 1994.
Right, and yeah, and well, that's one of the pieces that you know, was destroyed in the Montmartre fire. And it's interesting that more recently, a number of people are asking me about that work. People are actually wanting to buy work that disappeared in that Montmartre fire, and it's been around for, I mean, prior to the fire, it had been around, that work had been around for a decade, more or less. And so it's interesting, this sort of moment in time where you could have a kind of delayed response to work, because it could take a while before people really understand the context in which you're having these conversations about your body in relation to work. So my body circumference determined the scale of some of the work in the 80s, and in a way determines the kind of size and structure of these current pillow pieces, where you want to go and lie in these pillows, but it's this idea that actually there isn't any real comfort there. And, you know, there's implied comfort.
Would you allow the suggestion that there may be comfort of another kind?
Yeah. You mean in terms of,
as opposed to no, I don't know what that kind is, but like the comfort that you want from a pillow per se isn't there, but maybe in place of the comfort that you ask a pillow for, you find the comfort that you get from that work of art, or from that color, or that configuration, or I come after the art. I'm just saying random words. I don't know.
No, that's absolutely right though. In fact, a lot of the pillows I've sown seeds into, it kind of relates in a way to Relics in the Pillow of Dreams, a piece that's in the Tate now, which is, so that kind of, in a dream state, one could derive comfort in a dream state. So it isn't, so it's not really a literal finding comfort in the actual thing. It's the idea, it's the context, it's the psychological remit that one's constructing these different paradigms, these different conversations where, all right, it's an implication, but in reality, one could derive comfort from the action, one could derive comfort from the idea that it's implying comfort, but actually the visual nature of it implies a kind of comfort.
Right.
And so I just thought about that idiom, between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in language and how we understand meaning. And so there are different kinds of conversations that operate. So in fact, when I'm saying that it looks as though you could lie in it and it's not, it's quite a paradoxical statement, experience, that's only part of the conversation. They operate on different kinds of levels. In the way that Winnicott talked about the breast, or the nipple, or the blanket, and the shack you mentioned the other day. I was interested in the shack. As a child, I remembered we called those rattle toys shacks. And I don't know whether I first heard that word from my mother, or because in fact I know a lot of people call baby toys rattles. And so the shack tree is actually one of its names. It's radiant. I'm forgetting the actual name, but it the shack tree grows in different parts of the globe, and the flowers are tremendous. So there are all these different ways that the work makes sense, so that thinking about the shack and the drift seeds, that seeds moving across different global, in terms of oceans, that the seeds in drift seeds would germinate mostly in mangrove areas. But when we had that little conversation the other day about the poet Stanley Kunitz, and we talked about the longboat, and I started to think, oh my goodness, the longboat was making me think about a sculpture I made in the 80s called A Place in the Scheme of Things, which looks like a huge seed pod, but actually looks like a boat. And then it has these structures that sit at angles, but also thinking about the boat and the longboat, and that Kunitz was referring to the Viking mythology about the dead being put out to sea in their Viking ships. And so there are these, I mentioned that because it's the same way that I think about the cushions, that they operate on different levels of these conversations. And in different cultures, bodies are often sent off to sea as a final resting place. And so there are these different moments of actuality in the work.
I've come to think that we need to go to Robert momentarily, but I just want to say one thing as a way to thank you for all of this. I've come to think that conversations about the couple of big issues that have come up in the course of our discussion today tend to be better in the long run when they're complicated, precisely because the issues themselves are complicated. When simplistic approaches are taken to complicated matters, something crucial often is left behind, and it leaves one wanting for more. There's always going to be, hopefully, always time for more conversation. I look forward to more of it with you. I want to thank you again for this one, and for the one that began last year, or the year before last already. As awkward as it is, we need to change gears now to our moderated conversation with Robert and the Q&A people.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica and Darby. I would just like to say how much I really appreciated how how open and honest and generous and complicated, to use the word that Darby just used, the conversation felt. And these words fraught and complexity came up a lot. And it felt to me that it really demonstrates, Veronica, how you're continuously working through these thoughts, materials, and ideas that you've been discussing, and indeed have been for many, many years. So somehow there's this idea that the work and the thinking are always, in a sense, unfinished. And I think this comes through in the show, as you mentioned, anecdotally. You know, the night before the show opened, I was joking with you about the fact that you were continuing to stitch one of the works in the gallery and wouldn't leave it alone. And indeed, in the fabric sculptures that are in the show that contain avocado stones, you were mentioning before that, you know, under the right conditions, they have the potential to seed and to germinate. And I think that this is something that's that really fascinates me about the work, in terms of this potential, or this complexity, or this kind of sense of things being unfinished always remains. I don't know if that's a question, it's more of a comment, but I just wanted to thank you both for your openness and generosity. To loop it back, there's a question early on from Annie Tyhurst that was mentioning specifically the reference to Winnicott, and Annie's asking how Winnicott also said that play is integral to how we make sense of reality, and does this have meaning for Veronica?
Yes, I mean, play and reality, absolutely. Play is a way to work through different states. Absolutely, playing is crucial.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And another question from Susan is to say that it's wonderful to see you again, Veronica, and that she is very struck by the beauty and transformative qualities of the work. Are these key considerations for you? This idea of beauty and transformation.
Is this a question?
It is, yes.
Well, yes, yes, beauty. I don't think I start off thinking I'm going to make a beautiful object. I think if that was any part of the thinking, it would be a very empty structure. Also, the notion of transformation, that has to happen somehow in the work itself. I don't think I could deliberately make something transformative. I hope, it's a hope that the work transcends its kind of literalness in a way, and takes on different kinds of meanings, and that allowing one to be able to relate to the works on different levels. So I think both of those observations are crucial and very relevant, but they're not the intended remit of the work. I'm pleased if that occurs, but it's not how the ideas emerge.
I think if I could just follow on from that, I think that one thing that also is transformative in the exhibition is the choice of materials. I'm thinking specifically of these works of kind of orange peel sewn together, and thinking about how actually fundamentally the work itself changes over time by virtue of what it's constructed of. And so that's the kind of way in which, I guess, transformation kind of, you know, sneaks or kind of seeps into the show or the work. And another question I wanted to ask was of Darby, which was, you mentioned this idea earlier of craft as a cover story for other things that we might be interested in, which I just thought was a really interesting way of phrasing it. And I wondered what other cover stories there might be Veronica's work, or what you think are the key things that we should be interested in?
Oh, I don't do that kind of art history. The key things that we should be interested in. I mean, I was interested in calling out the when I said that thing about craft as a cover story, I meant simply that we could, I think, decide to conduct an entire viewing and reflection process and writing in that idiom, you know, from those prompts and inside the acknowledging the limitations that tradition and possibilities, of course, that tradition provides, but that by doing that we would miss a great deal that needs also to be considered. So I wanted craft as a cover story as a way of communicating, acknowledging very firmly that that is a way that one ought to think, provided that it is one of many ways that one thinks. But to decide what those ways of thinking ought to be in advance is really not my way. You got the wrong person for the job, if that's you know, I know you're not, you know, endorsing that approach. It's just that I'm trying at this moment in my own life anyway to experiment with the exact opposite approach, which is letting the work tell me how I should be thinking, and letting the words that the artist does choose to share about where they come from mean more to me than the ones that I bring with my expertise and my education and my obsessions and my, you know, tics. Does that make sense? Am I being clear?
It makes absolute sense. And to also be clear, I absolutely wasn't expecting you to tell us what are the three key things that we should be interested in Veronica's work. I'm picking up on your phrasing, and I think that it's really great for you to kind of explain that more clearly. And I think this idea of, you know, learning from the work, learning from the artist feels really integral, and something that I think in terms of audience experience of the work so far has been really fascinating to witness in terms of the, you know, diversity of perspective that people bring to the work and what it makes them think about. And this also speaks to its kind of complexity. And I think this idea of loadedness came up also earlier on in the conversation. But it doesn't have to be, you know, highlighting specific, you know, ideas or issues. And I absolutely wouldn't ask you to do that. But having said that, you do have this list of keywords, and so it'd be interesting to know where the keywords came from. I made my list. I was just staring at the images. I have 10 images of the show, and I just tried to put myself in the room with what I saw. And it was like, okay, if I were in the room, I would have to think about through. I would have to think, because I'm being made to deal with, like Veronica's things make me deal with throughness, suspension, compartment. I know from previous work, it's a previous interest, acknowledged in print, acknowledged in whatever. Placement, object being a word that explodes itself in all of its meanings, both material, psychoanalytic, capitalistic. So there's just, what excites me about what Veronica does is that it just activates the mind, and it activates regions of the mind that I don't use to read or to teach or to say what I do. I have to, you know, I discover them in the process of trying to respond to what is being offered, has been offered, what's been done, how it's been done, like how it seems to place me, how it places itself relative to other art and to the issues, loaded or not. Like in America, we have a pillow thing going on right now. This fucking lunatic person that Donald Trump befriended at some point during his presidency, Mike Lindell. He owns a company called My Pillow, and it's like suddenly the My Pillow guy is one of the most visible political figures on the right. So like if you put a pillow in an art show in the United States right now, you'd have to deal with like Trump and this idiot is in the room. They're in the room. So I know that that's not happening there. So I have to filter that out. I could have talked to you about the My Pillow guy for an hour, you know, but that, you know. I'm glad
and
you didn't.
you can, of course, you're glad I didn't. But it's like, I know stuff that I can think. I know ways that I can do my job, but every time I go into an art room, I got to do my job differently. I have to be a different person than the one I was in the previous art room that I was in. Otherwise, I'm just doing myself to art, which is not, it's not, we don't need anyone else doing that.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much, Darby. And I think, again, you know, having you explain that is incredibly useful, because I think this is precisely where this kind of meeting of the both of you is particularly brilliant, because I think that there's a lot of space that's opened up both in the work that's made and also in the interpretation of it. So thanks so much to you both again. I don't think we have any more time for any more questions. So I'm sorry if I missed a few at the end there, which I think I did. So sincere apologies for not covering a few that came in later. I got caught up and carried away. So I just want to say thanks so much to everybody for joining us this evening, and thanks again to the Freelance Foundation for their support. I also want and need to thank my colleagues at Spike Island who've made this event possible. So Olivia Jones, Carmen Julia, and Rosa Tyhurst. Special thanks though to our speakers this evening, Darby English and Veronica Ryan, for your generous contributions, especially given Darby's clearly expressed hatred of Zoom. But I also would like to thank Veronica in particular for the really outstanding exhibition, which everybody can visit in our galleries up until September 5th. So please check our website, spikeisland.org.uk, for opening times before you visit. And if you're not able to visit the exhibition in person, you can nevertheless access images, text, and an audio guide of the show online. And we would also like to invite you to join our forthcoming online events, which includes Veronica in conversation with Philip Barlow and Francis Morris, which is on the 12th of July at 6 p.m. If you'd like to support events like this, or indeed our exhibitions or artist development programs, then please do consider making a donation online, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much again, Veronica and Darby.
Thank you. Thanks.